This conversation was sponsored by Komodo, a zero-knowledge, peer-to-peer atomic swap exchange. Learn more at komodoplatform.com. Yeah, and it's a fascinating question. I've had personally a variety of issues with forum administrators in various forums, where maybe I start sort of hitting some of the sacred cows, right? Yeah. And then they just hit you with the ban hammer, and there's no kind of due process. There's no respect for free speech, and there's certain areas of free speech that are certainly grayer, right? When you start trying to spam, or you're making threats or stuff like that, right? There's certain gray areas that are acceptable, but when you're civil and you debate, for example, then you're just being an asshole. And yeah, okay, it's private property. You can certainly make an argument like that, but it's also, you're still violating a fundamental sort of due process rule, etc.
And what this walled garden model that we've become used to with the internet only dates back to the 1990s with the Cyber Promotions versus AOL case. Before that, the law of the land in the U.S. was Marsh versus Alabama, which was a 1946 case where the Supreme Court ruled that you don't lose your constitutional rights when you're in a company-owned town. And in that case, there were people handing out religious pamphlets, and the company sheriff arrested them on the sidewalk of this town in Alabama, and they sued for their free speech rights, and the court sided with the people handing out the pamphlets. And so that was the law of the land until AOL came along, and half of the traffic in AOL had become spam, and they needed a way to deal with it, and so they were just banning spammers. And the spammers sued under Marsh versus Alabama, and the courts ruled that an online bulletin board isn't enough like a real-life community to justify that protection under Marsh. And so my argument is that virtual reality, virtual worlds where you have a more robust and fully featured economy and community and social structure is a lot more like a real community than like a bulletin board. Mm-hmm. And so we're fighting against Linden Lab, had protests in the virtual world, and eventually got to the point where we had been doing some business with a university that they didn't like, and they wound up just seizing all of our assets, banning my accounts, taking all our money, our simulators, our content. And so we wound up in litigation with them for several years. And then we settled in 2014, and we used the proceeds to launch Galactic Systems. And from that and the lessons of the experience dealing with them, eventually developed the business plan that we have for Galactic Systems.
Let's talk about Galactic Systems. What is that?
Well, originally the idea was I was going to create a whole new virtual world platform where we were just going to treat people better like they had rights. We were going to have an avatar bill of rights, and we were going to have better physics and better graphics and simulate an entire galaxy of worlds and so forth. But we were funding it, we were developing our prototypes, and we were developing our Galacticoin blockchain to be the economic backbone for the system for handling all sorts of asynchronous data, whether not just cryptocurrency, but the smart contracts for 3D content licenses, for dispute resolutions, for virtual land and group registrations and memberships, and all sorts of things where you're dealing with administrative issues of contractual relationships between people that can be easily turned into smart contracts. And then we basically, the angel who was going to back our ICO pulled out on us, and we ran out of capital. And so I took a year off and studied the market and really looked at, why wasn't VR getting more acceptance more widely? And really the problem wasn't the clunky headsets, or it wasn't, the nausea from the headsets or just how you looked with them. It was really the business model, this walled garden model, where the corporations online take control of your identity, your ability to exist in the environment, your money, your content, and police you on what you say to people. And that's really anathema to everything we know about the basis of a civil society, where individual rights are the core of all authority, where we're only governed by our own consent. And if we don't consent, we shouldn't be tread on, have our liberties confiscated.
I expect there's going to be a lot of support, a lot of people that are going to be paying very close attention to that kind of court ruling or court battle. I know that there's some people in the the new conservative movement or alt-right or alt-light, depending on how you look at it, that have been getting banned on Twitter, banned on Facebook, and they're
right.
Very, very popular people. People like Milo Yiannopoulos, which has lovers and haters on every side. He's saying that kind of political change in the United States is coming because there's a clear problem in these massive walled gardens that are sort of fundamental social structures of society now that are making rulings with dictatorial powers.
Yeah, and I would argue
unconstitutional rulings that
these social networks really I'm not a fan of utilities law per se, but the fact is that Twitter and Facebook and these other social networks are utilities because they are a common carrier. They're used, even though yes, it's their private network, but Verizon's network is their private network. But legally, Verizon cannot refuse me service because of my political opinions. Mm-hmm. They can't do that to you because if that were the case, then you would have seen communists in the 50s refuse to be able to have a phone to communicate with each other, and that would never have flown in the courts then, because our rights of conscience and freedom of speech are sacrosanct. And so these Twitter and Facebook need to be brought into that same legal regime where, sure, it's their network. And sure, they have a right to police against actual illegal activity. But having an unpopular opinion is not an illegal activity. And as long as that's a company-owned network, it's a company-owned community, then you're dealing with Marsh versus Alabama, and people don't lose their basic rights when they're in a company-owned community.
Yeah, and I can already hear some of the anarcho-capitalists, like maybe the new brand of anarcho-capitalists saying, oh, that's statist, you're going to be using the state for your own benefits, and I just want to kind of like address that real quick. That this is what when we talk about sometimes when I talk about Facebook on spirituality or when people talk about values, right, or what's important in the world, like free speech and the ability to sort of maintain your individual rights within a given ecosystem. These are bars that we can aim for. And we need to defend. We need to fight for. And
if you go by those anarcho-capitalist definitions of private property, then really you only have rights when you're on your own private property.
Yeah.
Because in an anarcho-capitalist society, there will be no public property. There'll be no public rights of way. There'll be no, public forum. So the idea of free speech in the society they're talking about, either you have free speech everywhere or you really only have it in the privacy of your own room.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a fascinating thing about this whole debate is that currently, maybe in the future in a free society, right, we can speculate about how things would work. But in the current society, we can argue that, the domain that, that the court system and that, where the legal battles happen is a kind of public domain. It's sort of like being in the wilderness and we're sort of fighting to tame, different things or right. fighting to capture or domesticate certain parts of this social wilderness. And that's the battle, right? Like there's a lion over there and you're the tiger and you're fighting for a thing. But the conflict plays out in the courts and it plays out in civil discourse. And if it doesn't function at civil discourse, it escalates
right.
into violence or
and
domination.
If we're not free to have a civil discussion about, our disputes, what we disagree about, then what's the point of having any system of justice whatsoever? Because that's what justice is about, is talking out our differences while tolerating those differences and coming to an agreement as to who's in the right, who's in the wrong, and how we're supposed to get along together. And if you can't have a civil discussion, then there is no such thing as society or civilization. And so if you can't tolerate people on your property saying what they believe, then you really don't have much courage in your own convictions.
And you're thus not very civilized
yes.
your kind of individual spiritual integrity or
your
whatever. Right?
Beliefs,
like
if you have strong beliefs, you should believe that they're valid enough that they can survive somebody else disagreeing with you about them. And so this whole modern thing of the snowflakes, the fragile opinion syndrome, the inability to tolerate differing opinions, is just it's mind-boggling that this sort of thing. I mean, that's one thing we shouldn't tolerate in our society, is this sort of intolerance of differing opinions. Like, even if your opinion is objectionable to me, and I may disagree with you, and I may not personally do business with or associate with you, there's a difference between that and trying to shut you out of society. And the more time that we spend online, and the more of our lives, our economic lives, earning a living comes from being online, then it's a matter of life and death. If your living is made online, and then some company suddenly shuts you off from your economic lifeline just because of something you said, and you're not their employee, that's a serious wrong. And I don't care if it's their network. If they're making their network available to the public, that's essentially a public accommodation. They shouldn't be able to make a judgment as to who can say what. And because it's publicly open, if they want to have it regulated, it needs to be much more closed. Okay, you need to, for instance, vet who's allowed in the network. Not, if I can go in there and create a username and a password, that's not a vetting process. Even though it's a login, it's not a vetting process, because anybody can make any account there. So they're not checking IDs, they're not verifying IDs, they're not determining whether it's, I'm someone that belongs to their society or a group or club. Okay, so there's a difference. For instance, if we go, let's say, to public accommodations law, which a lot of libertarians hate as well, is that, if your door's open that anybody in the public can walk into because you're trying to get additional customers to come in without appointment, without making reservations, you're basically... It's an invitation. It's an invitation. I call it impersonating the public square. It's like if you go to a lot of public restaurants and so forth, particularly when the weather's warmer, they'll have tables and chairs on the outside of the building. Okay, is that their restaurant outside on the sidewalk with the tables, or is that the public domain? If it's public property and they're allowed to have the tables and chairs there, can you sit there and say whatever you want because it's a public right-of-way? Or can they eject you from the public property because they don't like what you're saying? Okay? And if the line between those public areas and their actual establishment is blurred because the doors are wide open and anybody can walk in and out without any vetting, no appointments made, no reservations, no way to check and verify who they're allowing in, then you're dealing with a situation where it's essentially a pseudo-public domain, and they have a duty of care and tolerance for what you're doing there. So if they don't want you in, they should have security checking everybody, keeping out people that they don't want ahead of time.
So if they vet, they lose, they gain certain rights, but if they don't vet, they're losing certain rights.
Right. So, this goes to, for instance, carrying firearms. Okay. A lot of, businesses that are anti-gun, as more and more states allow more people to carry concealed or open weapons in public, businesses that are anti-gun will post their sign on their door saying no weapons allowed. But there's no security there to check you to see whether you're armed, no metal detector to see if you've got a concealed weapon. And so if they're telling all the law-abiding people that they can't carry a gun, and so they leave their guns in their car where they can be broken into and stolen very easily, and they're sitting unarmed in the restaurant, they're now in a gun-free zone, so they're far easier victims. And someone who just disregards the sign can come in with a weapon and shoot a bunch of people. So you have far more damage, far more death and injury. Who's responsible for that? Is the shooter the only person responsible, or is the public accommodation owner responsible for making that an area where people are more easily victimized because they're disarmed? So in public accommodations law, there's this thing called the duty of care. All right. So, for instance, if there's water on the floor, it's slippery, and someone slips and falls and is injured, the building owner or the restaurateur or store owner is responsible. They're liable for that because they did not fulfill their duty to care for the safety of the people patronizing their accommodation. It's the same situation. They're creating a situation where it's not safe by requiring people to be unarmed. So they have a duty of care. They have a liability for any injuries.
Right.
Okay, so if you're going to enforce these sort of rules, you have to be liable for the consequences. So similarly with public networks, if you're going to be the game god where you're governing what people can do and say and behave, then you're also liable for the consequences of that. If it damages people's public reputations, if it interferes with their ability to make their living, you're liable for those losses.
Yep. Yeah, it makes sense. There's a kind of balance in that where, if people restrict your freedoms and your rights to carry a gun, with that they're sort of gaining that responsibility to protect you, right? Because there's a particular intent and function to that.
I'm from New Hampshire, and in New Hampshire, I can carry a gun anywhere in the state other than courtrooms. And even when I go to court, I can bring a gun to court, and the bailiff has a gun check at the door. And I can check my gun in, they give me a ticket, and I go in.
And it's well guarded.
And it's well guarded. So they're guarding, even though everyone in the court is unarmed, they're safe because the court is assuming the responsibility of their safety. And that's really the level of duty that people should be assuming with their businesses if they're going to prohibit people from being able to defend themselves. And with other exercises of their liberty, when they confiscate those rights on the property, they're assuming a duty, a liability for their actions to look after their clients. And so if you're going to be restricting people, there's this principle that some legal scholars have developed called the God paradox with regard to particularly online networks. And the idea is that if you have no standards at all, you don't police anybody in your network, you're not responsible for anything they do. If you do police your network, you're responsible for everything everyone does, which is kind of paradoxical. But the idea is that if you're not policing people on your network, you're a common carrier. You're basically creating essentially a pseudo-public domain where people are not limited in how they can access and behave and interact with each other. And they're each responsible for their own protection, but also for their own behavior. If you use that illegally, if you're on the phone and you're swatting people with the phone system, the phone company's not responsible for the consequences of your swatting somebody. You're responsible.
That's fascinating. Has that principle been tested in law in the United States?
There's some cases about that. I can't name them offhand, but it's one of these areas where you're dealing with different legal communities in different states. So you'll have states like New Hampshire, which has a much more libertarian legal tradition, that will say, this is more a matter of a God paradox where people should be free to do what they want. And then you have states like California, New York, where it's much more of a nanny state, and they say you have to police your user base and so forth. And so this is an area of conflict between the different states, and it's something that may eventually get worked out through the federal courts.
That's fascinating. Yeah, so I think that's a an interesting way that we've sort of delineated kind of the importance of freedom of speech and how conflicts end up being resolved in society if civil discussion doesn't function well enough. But the point of free speech and this kind of principles is sort of to be able to try to prevent that, because either way, if it doesn't get resolved at the civil level, it's going to escalate at further levels, right? And there's a kind of wisdom, without, there's plenty of ways to criticize a lot of the ways that justice systems work in society, and some countries definitely do it way worse than others. But there is a kind of wisdom in the way that that the courts that you gave us an example of have structured their environment. Right. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. But yeah.
And so by having sensors all along that, those are all addressable IP objects in the Internet of Things.
We humans, we mortal humans in the Dash community are basically helping the gears that move it, that we can fall away and this thing will continue.
People developed all the ideas of what we now call the technological singularity and the transhumanist movement.